I looked all around for some solitary place to bunk, just right for my misanthropy. But hog pens, stables, doghouses, all were occupied by their four-footed inhabitants. Finally, I caught sight of some premises being used as a storeroom, right at the edge of a pond. The ground was muddy, and dampness oozed from the walls. Despite these bad hygienic conditions, I took up residence there, in the company of one of our drivers, my friend Vidal, a son of Carcassonne, who had lived in Périac for some time. But we had to acquire, whatever the cost, a bit of straw. Even with our billfolds in hand, we couldn't get hold of even an armful. But in a courtyard we spotted a vehicle which had been used to carry some pigs, calves, or sheep to market, in which lay a nice pile of straw. Like thieves making off with a treasure chest, we carried off this straw and spread it out over some planks of wood. The bedding problem was solved. Oh, how happy I was when I was able to be off by myself, to slip away, to avoid everyone else, to withdraw from that atmosphere of the crowded encampment, from the snoring and the belching of some, from hearing the petty quarrels of irate card players who stayed up half the night, from listening to the rude songs, the stupidities of those who had one too many gulps of pinard. How I preferred the silence, the solitude, away from all this noise, this brouhaha which prevented my spirits from rising above the sad reality. Those who did not fear the Siberian beasts, the gendarmes, and the cost would go in the evenings to the neighbouring town of Aumale, where there were stores, cafes, and shops of every sort. In vain did they tell us every day at assembly that it was forbidden to go there without authorization. The poilus made fun of this, and on Sundays, when I would go there with some comrades, we would be at least 1,000, strolling the streets with the glorious patch of the 296th right there on our greatcoats. The gendarmes who guarded the entrances to Aumale were powerless in the face of this invasion. If they hadn't had the prudence to stand aside quietly, and if, especially after dark, they had tried to arrest a poilu, they'd have been thrashed and massacred without pity. There was nothing to be done about it. Such was the attitude of the combatant, who felt pity for the Boche who shared the same sufferings and dangers as he did, but who had sworn ferocious hatred for the gendarme, this slacker who was trying to bother him, keep an eye on him, spoil his rest and his liberty as soon as he got out of the trenches. On January 13th, in freezing cold and 15 centimetres of snow, we made our way to a spot near Aumale to participate in a review, in which the units of our new division would meet up. For several hours we had to march and parade like in any respectable review, tramping in the mud and snow, and we got back to Morvillas after dark. We could have done without this promenade and this parade. I was about to say, or write, masquerade. But the suffering and the fatigue of thousands of men count for little to the big military chiefs. Tradition and custom must be carried on, rules must be followed, rites must be acted out. On January 16th at 5 in the morning, in terrible cold, I left Morvilla with a detachment of fellow leave-takers to catch the train at Aumale. The train was supposed to depart, or rather to pass through, at 7 o'clock, but like all the trains full of leave-takers, it was way behind schedule. Since the station was already overflowing with people who were going to breathe their native air, we had to stay outside and undergo some vigorous calisthenics from time to time against the cold. On the station platform, in a pile of merchandise, a box had spilled open, and an indiscreet poilu had stuck his hand inside and pulled out a bottle of rum. This produced a mad rush, and in 2 minutes the case was emptied. War destroys in man, who in uniform becomes an anonymous creature, all sense of honesty. When killing becomes a duty, a holy thing, then stealing is no more than a peccadillo. Finally, at 9 o'clock, the long-awaited train took us away, and at 10 we were at Beauvais, where we had a long wait. At 9 p.m. we were at the Servilliers switching station south of Creil. Because of the congestion of rail lines around Paris, it took many long hours to make our way across the metropolitan area, so that it wasn't until 1 a.m. that we arrived at Orléans, too late for the last train to Toulouse. More long hours to wait for another train, in the inhospitable station of Orléans. But a train for Bordeaux was ready to pull out, and we piled on board. Much better to ride on an express train than to pace back and forth in a station. A detour of 200 or 300 kilometres meant little to us, We were travelling for free, and the Bosch would pay the bill when the final accounts were settled. Unfortunately, at that time there was a shortage of window glass, and on trains many windows had only their frames. You can imagine that the compartments available to us were those which had only one pane of glass at most. That made for rather exaggerated ventilation, especially with a temperature of several degrees below zero. But when you're going home on leave, it's as if you are seized with madness. You're indifferent to everything. If it meant leaving sooner, we'd have climbed onto the roofs of the cars. Naturally, the cars weren't heated. It was necessary to save coal. Despite how tough our hides were, we almost froze during this long January night, shivering as we piled up in the corners, huddled next to one another. It was with joy that at 8 in the morning we put our feet down on the platform of the Bordeaux railway station. A radiant sun warmed our benumbed limbs, and after a couple of hours strolling in the streets of the capital of Gascony, we left at 1 in the afternoon for Languedoc. 12 hours later, at 1 in the morning, I crossed the threshold of my home, where my loved ones, alerted by telegram, awaited me. I found spirits in the village greatly changed since my last home leave. The disaster in Romania, the dispatch of numerous forces to Salonika, the imminent call-up of the conscript class of 1918, the numbers of those exempted from service who had escaped the net of the recruitment boards, the shortages of sugar, coal and transport, all those had turned a sunny optimism into sombre pessimism, as eyes began to open onto how things really were. Alas, 7 days passed quickly, and on January 28th it was time to take the road back with an angry heart. Having learned from my friends at the front that the regiment had left the Somme and was already at the front lines on the border of Champagne and the Argonne, I figured out that by altering my route slightly, I could spend one more day with my family. Those who read these lines later on will say, "Bah, 1 day more or less, that's no big deal." True, it was only 24 hours of 60 minutes each, but as these hours and minutes were so precious, how we savoured them, in spite of the bitterness and the apprehension of our departure. As we crossed the middle of France by night, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the windows were decorated with arabesques of ice. The countryside was covered with snow. It was sure going to be nice in the Argonne trenches. Passing through Sens, we saw the firemen putting out a fire in a railway station building, started by a bombardment which had just taken place. There were 4 victims. The place where the accident happened was covered with shattered rubble and all kinds of debris, still smoking. An agitated crowd pressed forward at the edges, but the soldiers who thronged our train took it all in with an indifferent eye. Ruins, fires, the injured and the dead, they were utterly blasé at sights like these. At 4 in the afternoon we passed through Troyes. Night fell, the cold rose up again. We would have liked to get down, to have dinner and spend the night there, but departures were strictly forbidden. Good tables and nice beds weren't for us, the poor pilgrims of death. At 3 in the morning the train stopped at Valmy, the station where I had to get off. To welcome the leave-takers there was a barrack where a glacial cold reigned, despite a smoky stove placed in the middle which no one could get close to, since it was surrounded by 20 poilus vainly trying to gather some bit of warmth from it. I tried to lie down on one of the wooden benches along the walls, but after a few minutes the cold forced me to pace back and forth in the barrack until dawn. They granted us a quart of warm drink which they called coffee, and each of us left to join his own unit, guided by the ration squads which had come to the Valmy station. We passed through the historic village. As we left, I looked for the famous legendary windmill, but they told me that it had been a long while since any grain had been milled there. Not one stone remained, but a signpost indicated to passers-by where it had stood. With my eyes I gazed across this battlefield where the fate of France, of the Revolution, and perhaps of all Europe had played out, and I was astonished. According to the accounts, the illustrations, the paintings, I had supposed that Valmy was right at the entrance to a gorge, and that there the invasion had been halted like a torrent rushing down a mountainside, and was hurled back right at the point where it would spill forth and spread onto the plain. But the landscape was flat and ordinary, a wide open plain, with here and there some slight undulations in the terrain. I stopped at a promontory, from which perhaps Goethe and the Duke of Brunswick had observed the phases of the action, a simple skirmish compared to the titanic battles of the Flanders, Verdun, or the Somme. The countryside, covered with a blanket of snow, was silent, the roads almost deserted. Barely in the distance you could hear occasional cannon fire. This was a calm sector. What a difference from the Somme sector, where the roads were incessantly crowded day and night, with interminable columns of caissons, trailers, artillery, and vehicles of every sort, not to mention the troops going to and from the trenches. 7 kilometres from Valmy we came upon a half-demolished village, Dommartin-sous-Hans. A few tenacious inhabitants still remained, despite the shells which rained down fairly frequently. I had the happy surprise of finding there the drivers and the crew of a 37 field gun, at rest, well installed in an intact house furnished with tables, chairs, mirrors on the walls, etc. Each trooper slept on a cot or a mattress. We were like real bourgeois, true shirkers. My own team was due to come here for their 6-day rest break the very next day. All I had to do was wait for them. That evening, just when we were taking our meal around a big fire, 4 explosions shook the house, followed by a clattering of broken tiles. It took a few seconds to figure out what was going on. Then there was a stampede to the basement, but that was all the excitement we had that evening. A shell had fallen on a nearby house where the food stores were located. Luckily, it had exploded when it hit the roof and had made a big hole there, damaging nothing more than a row of sausages, put there by someone with the ill-fated idea of hanging them from an attic rafter to dry. A second shell had fallen right in front of our lodging, into a corral where about 20 of our horses and mules were tethered. 3 of these animals lay on the ground. One of them was headless, while the 2 others were breathing their last death rattles, and to relieve their suffering someone finished them off with pistol shots. Fraisse, whose appetite was always excited by a glacial bise, was elated at the thought of the fine cuts of horsemeat which he would enjoy over the next few days. From morning to night, our stove and grill were busy transforming the choice cuts of these poor beasts into delicious and savoury steaks, which were stuffed into Fraisse's bottomless belly and expanded his rotundity by several centimetres, enhancing the jowls of his ruddy face. His belly satisfied, Fraisse grew more jovial, and by his jokes and colourful and picturesque expressions, he cheered up those whose minds were most afflicted by le cafard anxiety. For variety, he tried to hunt down some harmless sparrows, but all he caught was a scrawny little owl, which he summarily executed and plucked. Alas, it was so skinny that when you pressed on its belly, it squeaked like a little baby. Fraisse wandered out, and approaching groups of soldiers coming up to their billets, he pressed on the owl's belly and stupefied those who thought they were hearing a newborn's whimpers. After a bit of this entertainment, the little owl went right into Fraisse's own belly, following the horse and mule meat portions which had preceded it. The next day, my comrades from the gun crew came to spend 6 days of rest at the billet. The house belonged to a little old lady, still quite alert despite her 75 years. She now lived in the village with her son. 20 times a day, her hands in a hand warmer, she paid us visits, and with her ferret's eye she checked to see that all the furniture, the walls, the windows, the ceiling and the floor hadn't suffered any damage, because we were threatened with expulsion at the first sign of any harm to the building or the furnishings. "Old witch! What a leech! Go to hell, you maniac!" we called out in our regional slang at each inspection visit. One day, she went to the cantonment's duty officer to get us to vacate the premises, because the smoke was blackening her dwelling place. We had to invoke the impossibility of lodging elsewhere, and to promise to light our fires only in a single, out-of-the-way, cold and shabby room. This old lady cursed the Germans who had installed themselves as masters of her house for 2 weeks in 1914. I believe that she would have readily pardoned them for the massacre of Louvain and the destruction of Reims, but not for breaking the front panel of an old armoire and stealing a soup tureen. Some time afterward, frequent bombardments forced the inhabitants to evacuate the village. The old lady had her house demolished, and she herself got a German shell fragment in one of her buttocks. According to the inhabitants, the Germans in 1914 hadn't done any serious damage, and it was almost with pride that they showed us a shed where the Crown Prince, the real one, not our ridiculous adjutant major, had garaged his motorcar. During our stay in Domartin, the thermometer wavered between 12 and 15 degrees below 0 Celsius every day. You can appreciate the suffering of the soldiers in the trenches. And to think that in the rear, in Paris above all, they were complaining loudly that they didn't have enough coal to heat their dwellings, the theatres, the cinemas. These complaints were an insult to those who were condemned by this odious war to live outdoors, so to speak. On February 6th at nightfall, it was our team's turn to go up to the front line. We passed through the village of Courtemont, less damaged than Domartin. We passed by the barracks of Côte 202, where our battalion had come to spend 6 days of rest. Then, close to Minecourt, we reached a height called the Promontory, where our brigadier general had installed himself, facing the opposing escarpment held by the enemy. We climbed this height by means of a communication trench. Then we headed down the opposite slope and found ourselves at the foot of another hill, the index finger, one of the fingers of the famous main hand. The ravines separating these fingers are dotted with cemeteries where so many fellows from the Midi have come to their final rest, paying the price for the famous victory in Champagne in September 1915. This Man de Massige is formed by 6 hills extending from a little plateau. But since a Christian's hand has only 5 fingers, one of them was baptized the false thumb. It's there that we came to relieve our comrades, in a very good shelter, with a wire mesh cot for each one of us. In the middle of the room, a big iron drum had been made into a stove, fueled by wood that we stole, fatherland forgive us, from a neighbouring supply depot. In the morning, we carried our field gun up close to the front lines and set up a battery out in the open, but we had orders not to open fire first unless the enemy attacked, which perfectly suited our Pacific temperament. To get across the Faux-Pouce, you passed through a tunnel, 150 metres long, through which ran the rails of a Decauville train. Along either side of this tunnel opened galleries and rooms where whole companies were sheltered, but they were extremely damp and dark. Half of the team, with Sergeant Gautier, and the other half, with me, divided the day on the front line with the cannon, and in the evening the piece was brought back to the shelter, where we spread out like embusquets, protected from the rigorous cold of this hard month of February 1917. During the night of February 14th to 15th, at 1 in the morning, we were tumbled from our beds by a sudden violent bombardment which the Germans unleashed on our lines. Shaken, we SS got up to see what was happening. Shells were falling all around, even on the edge of our shelter, normally a peaceful corner. It was clear that this bombardment, completely unexpected, was the prelude to a German infantry attack. At dawn, the cannonade redoubled in fury. The villages in the rear, the roads, the batteries, our rolling field kitchens sheltered behind a hillock called the Half Moon 400 metres away from us, all were heavily shelled. Then, suddenly, the bombardment became very violent on the regiment on our left, the 208th, less intensive on ours, the 296th, and insignificant on the regiment to our right, the 13th. Since our gun was placed in the 13th Regiment's sector, we could take our usual position. From there we looked down on the ravines and the slopes which were under fire from the German batteries. The spectacle was impressive, and you had to think back to the tragic days of Lorette, Verdun and the Somme to conceive of a bombardment like this one. It lasted until 3 in the afternoon. At precisely that hour, the German artillery lengthened its range, and the earth shook under our feet, rocked by detonation of underground mines which bowled over our front lines. Right away we saw Germans storming the positions occupied by the 208th Regiment. The occupants, holed up in the deepest shelters, barely offered any resistance and surrendered. We could see them in bunches, marching away beyond the German trenches, toward exile, forced labour, hunger, fatigue, but far from the zone of death, with the near certainty of one day seeing their native villages and their familial homes again. The German communiques reported the number of prisoners they took from us at 1050. Meanwhile, the Germans, having occupied the second line of trenches, pushed no farther, but they tried to widen this breach by attacking from the rear the positions occupied by our regiment, which found itself in a very bad spot by this flank attack. Nevertheless, the Germans made no progress, Besides, they didn't appear to be at full strength, only one of their regiments, the 78th, being engaged. For them, it was only a local limited action, requiring a minimum of preparation, which passed unnoticed by our side and found us completely unprepared for their bombardment. There were, in the 296th Regiment, some examples of individual heroism. A machine-gun sergeant, with all his men killed or wounded, stayed alone at his weapon and put the Germans, who got as close as 30 metres to him, to flight. In a boyau, a corporal, summoned to surrender by a Boche officer, replied with a pistol shot and caused the officer to disappear. A captain of the 208th Regiment and a few men, including 2 squads from the 296th, who were completely surrounded, held out behind barricades of sandbags and were able to rejoin our side overnight. The principal cause of the enemy's halt seems to me to be an error in aiming their artillery, which kept firing violently but did not lengthen its range enough. Its curtain of fire put a barrier in front of the infantry's advance. In the 208th Regiment was my old comrade, Périax Gabriel Gills, who got out of this scrape safe and sound. Before the attack, only 1 battalion out of 3 was up at the front line. From that day forward, all 3 battalions were jammed into the trenches without sufficient shelters, obliged to get their rations, do work details, and relieve each other practically in the open. The communication trenches having been levelled at several points or filled with water and mud. What had been a sector of quiet repose had become, in 24 hours, the scene of exhaustion, suffering and death, as bombardments and shellings on the fly were generously served up to us. The 37mm field gun to our left was demolished by a 105mm shell, but the crew got out without a scratch, having taken refuge in a deep shelter nearby. On February 18th, our squad was supposed to go for 6 days of rest, but instead of going to Dommartin, we had to be happy with going 1 kilometre to the rear, simply in reserve, the whole regiment being up at the front line. We went to the index finger. This hill had the honour of sheltering in its slope our Colonel Robert, having no doubt found the existing dugout unworthy of sheltering such an important personage. The engineers were building another, more spacious one. There I met Périax Louis Lalac, later killed in the final months of the war, who was a corporal in the engineers, and who confided in me that the value in material alone, the labour being at no cost, came to at least 10,000 francs. Inside the index finger there were veritable catacombs filled with hundreds of wire mesh cots, but complete darkness and extraordinary humidity reigned. Water seeped through, dripped from the vaulted ceiling, soaked through the walls, which were sometimes wood-panelled and formed huge puddles. A bad place for anyone suffering from sciatica or rheumatism. Outside there were plenty of area shelters, open to the elements and with corrugated sheet metal roofs and terraces along the twisting road, which snaked down from the summit of the index finger to its base. Unfortunately, we were prey to very clever German artillerymen. Through enfilading or plunging fire, they found a way to rain their shells down upon whatever point in the flank was exposed to them. As a result, most of the inhabitants had abandoned the surface shelters and sought refuge underground. All the way at the end, there was a shelter covered by a large piece of metal, too thin, alas, which a shell had pierced like an eggshell. Inside were a table, benches, cots, a windowed door, brought from who knows where, kept out the draughts. Finally, a supreme luxury, there was a lamp glowing with light. One can imagine that this habitation wasn't meant for vulgar poilus from the trenches. If it had been abandoned for the use of whoever came along, that's because several times a day, and even at night, a volley of shells from less than 20 metres away fell right in front of the shelter, shattering the crosses in an adjacent cemetery and killing inoffensive frogs which inhabited a pond and a large stream at the end of the ravine. These shells, it is true, were only puny 77s or 90s. But whether you're killed by a shell the size of your fist or by one as big as a flour sack, you're just as dead. Despite the danger, 4 artillerymen, fanatical card players, set up shop in this tempting shelter, seduced by the prospect of interminable card games they could have, day and night. The rest of us occupied a cabin right near the crest, thinking ourselves to be perfectly secure. But one night, without warning, a 105 shell crashed down, barely a metre from our roof, right onto a neighbouring shelter which luckily was empty of any tenants. We saw in this a providential warning, and cursing the Kaiser's gunners, we shifted to quarters underground. Before the business of February 15th, the index finger enjoyed almost complete calm. It was an important point in the sector. There was a railway station, yes, a railway station, which was filled with all kinds of supplies brought up by trains, called tacos, on a 0.6mm gauge rail line. It was even a marshalling yard, because several lines led out from there, going to Beausejour, the Half Moon, and the other fingers of the Main de Massige. There was a watering station with a motorized pump. A generator fed electric power to light up the shelters. In an underground stable there was a troop of little donkeys used for ration details and for transporting supplies, and finally 3 cows furnishing their milk to His Majesty the Colonel, and to the sick in the infirmary. After the Germans had bagged 1,000 prisoners on February 15th, General Nivelle declared that, whatever the cost, in human lives except his own, we had to retake the lost ground. Numerous heavy, tractor-mounted artillery pieces quickly were brought up, and on February 23rd they opened a terrible bombardment onto the German positions. Unfortunately, some of these pieces aimed too short, and their shells landed right on our lines, claiming victims. I myself heard Colonel Robert declare that if they continued to kill his men, he was going to hand in his resignation. The French attack was to have taken place on the night of February 23rd to 24th, but the regiment given that assignment had been decimated in the approach trenches by the enemy barrages. In a pouring rain, what was left of this regiment had to pull back, and the attack was postponed. During that night, 2 Germans, for whom the war held no further charms, surrendered. Brought the next day to the colonel's post on the index finger by Perrier, our lieutenant's aide, they said that the fire from our batteries had made their trenches untenable, and that we would have met no serious resistance. After having gathered this and other bits of intelligence, our colonel dismissed the prisoners, snarling, "Get this garbage out of here!" On February 24th, our 6 days of rest having expired, we went up at 9 p.m. to relieve the team at the front line, on the regiment's left. 600 or 700 metres from the index finger stood another hill, the Half Moon. Up against this Half Moon hill, our rolling field kitchens took shelter. It was the terminus of the Taco railway line and the corduroy road by which the ration carts arrived. 2 men from the squad and I stayed at the Half Moon, lodged like termites in the underground galleries furnished with cots. In front of the entrance, 3 fresh springs bubbled up and fed a stream which snaked its way toward Massiges. Our task consisted of sending rations up to our gun team at the front line. Each evening, when the ration squad came back from the gun, I went to the index finger to take the report to our lieutenant from Sergeant Gautier, the gun's commander. Without the shells which fell upon the Half Moon, this would have been a leisurely assignment. But since February 15th, the enemy gunners paid particular attention to us. This wouldn't have been of particular importance, except that the regiment's field kitchens were set up right there. The cooks had only the most precarious shelters, and it called for real courage on their part to not quit their posts and throw off their aprons to the devil. The field kitchen of our 4th Machine Gun Company was particularly exposed. When shells exploded too nearby, the cooks and their assistants fled into whatever shelter was handy. Only Master Chef Mauler stayed at his post, unperturbed. If there was less glory in dying with a ladle than with a rifle in hand, there was still a bit of heroism in it. For his tranquil courage, his absolute disregard of any danger, he was awarded the Croix de Guerre. Later on, maybe the worthy corporation of cooks of the Great War will be full of pride about this distinction earned by one of their very own. I'm in the habit of noting down here the characters who offer some sort of originality. I therefore can't leave our own Cordon Bleu in the shadows. He deserves to be remembered in posterity, not so much for the succulence and variety of his menus, no matter how much attention he brought to them, but for other remarkable qualities. Mauler was tall and thin. In his usual pose, holding in one hand the lid of his cooking pot, wreathed in the steam which emerged from it, he evoked the image of the god Vulcan at his forge. He alone set the menus. He relied solely on his own experience in deciding just how a ragout should taste. Every day he arose well before dawn to make the coffee. He never left to others the task of preparing this sacred potion. He presided at the smallest distribution, and despite the daily fluctuation of manpower due to arrivals and departures of leave-takers, those being evacuated, etc., you wouldn't give a thought to squeezing out an extra serving of meat or pinard. He knew from memory, without fault, exactly what each squad was due. He was the sole dispenser of goods from the kitchen. Whoever wanted a clove of garlic, an onion, or a mug of coffee had to present himself to his omnipotent personage, and with the seriousness of a presiding judge he would agree or not agree, with no room for appeal. He'd gotten the nickname Paper. I never learned why or how. One day, having gone to the kitchens to carry back our rations, I was surprised, 50 metres from our shelter, by a volley of 4 105mm shells exploding around me. Violently thrown to the ground by the concussion, I thought I was dead, or nearly so. My comrades, who saw this happen to me from the threshold of the shelter, were sure I'd been blown to bits. They rushed to my aid, and were astonished to see me get up on my own. Checking that all my limbs were in working order, I couldn't find a scratch. But all the canteens and pots of food were pounded into marmalade, and we had to go begging to Paper, who kindly gave us some leftovers for our meal. Death had brushed right past me maybe 20 times and turned aside. Once again, a mysterious hand seemed to have saved me from a hideous certain death. In the half-moon was also stationed Périac's own Vatel, Louis Richardis, Master Chef, as I've already written, for those two colourless characters, our Commandant and our Capitaine Adjutant Major Cros-Méreviel. One evening he had the generous idea of inviting all the sons of Périac in the vicinity to a sumptuous feast in his ramshackle cabin, destined any day to be blown to bits by some shell which will find it in its path. But our friend Richardis was a fatalist. What is written, and there's no use fighting against destiny. He cooked away, turning the rotisserie in his cabin as calmly as if he were back in his hotel in Périac. What joy, what happiness to find ourselves around a table, a real table in places and in times like those, among friends, comrades, compatriots, forgetting the sadness of the present. The conversation turned to our village, to the small everyday events, gossip, tittle-tattle, idle talk, sad stories of dead men, a long list of those who, as the newspapers said, voluntarily offered up the sacrifice of their lives. Among the Périacois guests was Joseph Espagnol, a private in the 13th Regiment of our division, whose shelter was near mine. Late at night, the meal having ended, and having done the honours to a good, hearty wine, even though it wasn't a wine from our Minervois region, Espagnol and I made our way back to our bunkers. The weather was Siberian cold. There was a thin coat of icy snow, and the slick footing made our progress difficult. My comrade slipped and sprained a leg. Limping along, supported by my shoulder, he reached his mole hill and was evacuated the next day, his leg grossly swollen. That's one guy who will remember our dinner at the half-moon. Since February 15th, the overworked men were in a state of great fatigue. Through his good efforts, our colonel was able to get us to change places with a regiment of the division, the 29th, which was occupying the sector of Ville-sur-Tourbe. On March 2nd, 1917, at 9 in the evening, we left the Main de Massige to head for Ville-sur-Tourbe. So at 9 p.m. on March 2nd, in a driving snowstorm, our group assembled at the index finger and headed off toward our new sector, about 6 kilometres away, dragging our pieces with our own muscle power, which was hard enough. But worse than that was having to walk on a corduroy road made with logs placed one next to the other. Some of the logs were splintered, others were pushed down or stuck up. In spite of the bitter cold, our shirts were soaked with sweat. When we left the road, we crossed an area of ruins, including the shell of a church. That was Massiges. Further along, other ruins, Virginie. Then other ruins appeared, just as gloomy and forlorn. That was what was left of Ville-sur-Tourbe. Since it was our team's turn to be in reserve, our guide led us to a shelter, a cellar in the midst of the ruins. Ville-sur-Tourbe was considered a rest area. Each day the Boche sent a half-dozen shells our way, Out of politeness, our artillerymen sent about the same number. That was all. The village was only a kilometre from the front line. A river, the Tourbe, cut through it, pushing its troubled and muddy waters across swampy areas which we had to cross to get to the trenches. For a stretch of about 400 metres, you had to cross on footbridges mounted on pilings, between two rows of gabions, wooden cribs, baskets filled with earth to protect us from being seen and being shot. But these gabions were slowly sinking into the water, almost all the way along the route, so that when it was necessary to venture out onto the footbridges by daylight, you had to hurry and commit your fate to the generosity of the German machine gunners who had their weapons trained on them. During our stay there were some victims, but nevertheless very few. As for me, I went by there maybe 100 times, and there was only one day when a myopic machine gunner mistook me, with my sergeant's binoculars and my walking stick, for an officer or some other eminent personage, and did me the honour of sending a couple of bullets whistling past my ears. The Germans occupied the train station, and we the church. When the parishioners return, they'll find their church bells in front of the colonel's billet, hanging from the branches of an apple tree, ready to sound the alarm in case of a poison gas attack. Those who cast those bells would never have imagined that they would be put to such a use. The regiment's kitchens were set up a few hundred metres from the village, on the banks of the Tourbe, practically out in the open, barely protected from the enemy's view by a little clump of poplars. As the Germans had set up their own kitchens near their trenches, it was by reciprocal tolerance that on each side, in a common interest, we each let the peaceful cooks go about their business in peace at their kettles. If this had happened in the Midi, land of the Mistral and the Serres, local names for winds particular to southern France, the Germans could have smelled the aroma of our stews, borne by the wind, and we'd have gotten the vapours of their tasteless choucroute, sauerkraut. In front of the village, separating the opposing lines, there was a calvaire, roadside devotional sculpture still standing, with a tall Christ and a statue of the Virgin. What a symbol! Between combatants, this Christ and this murdered Virgin, riddled with bullets, seemed to have been put there in mute and tragic protest. But alas, Christ, called so powerful, let this excruciating torment weigh down on us, and limited himself to this mute, platonic protest. One afternoon I had accompanied the gun team bosses up to the trenches to reconnoitre the eventual placement of our cannon, should an attack or a raid occur. When we came back, we ran into Captain Cheffaut of the 4th Machine Gun Company on the threshold of his shelter. With a wave of his hand, he stopped me. "Corporal Barthas," he said, "I have to notify you that I'm going to have you court-martialed for dealings with the enemy." Captain Cheffaut was a university graduate of some merit, but alas, he was an inveterate alcoholic, rather too familiar with his men, sometimes joking with them and then suddenly, for no reason at all, loading them down with inspections, wearing them out on the drill field, imposing a rigorous discipline on them. Several times he had tried to saddle our group with his despotic authority, but each time he had run up against the resistance of our Lieutenant Lorius defending our autonomy. The accusation of our captain was so outrageous that at first I didn't take it seriously. "He's drunk," I told myself. "He's just having fun with me, trying to scare me." "My captain," I replied with a smile, "is surely joking." "No, I'm not joking. There are 4 witnesses ready to testify against you." "Oh, come on," I said with some impatience. "This is the first time today that I've been up to the front lines. This accusation is absurd. You're making a mistake for sure. It's not here at Ville-sur-Tourbe. It's at Côte 193 in Champagne, at outpost number 10, that you had dealings with the Boches." I felt beads of cold sweat at my temples. I couldn't suppress a trembling of my limbs. Had the secret of outpost number 10 been betrayed? I saw myself lost. In a few seconds I called up the memory of those anguished 24 hours, at 6 paces away from the German outpost. The grenade thrown at the officer who snuck up on us by night, trying to catch us at fault. How he burst in, revolver in hand, yelling threats. Then, in the morning, I myself warning the Germans that we were under a strict watch, and that they shouldn't show themselves or talk to us. Evidently this was, in the eyes of the brass hats, an unpardonable crime. And 4 men of my squad were found who would denounce me, after 6 months, to this authoritarian, mean-spirited captain, loathed by his men. No, this wasn't possible. But where were my poor little Bleu from Champagne? All dead or shipped out? Delattre had deserted to Switzerland. Having escaped from a German concentration camp and made it back to French lines, he had pleaded not to be sent back up to the front, so he wouldn't fall into German hands again and risk a firing squad. All they were willing to do was to change the name in his paybook. Profiting from a furlough, Delattre took off for a country, Switzerland, where the minds of those in charge had resisted the winds of universal madness. The only other veteran, the Périacois Paul Alpech, was dying in a hospital in the Midi. There was only my little buddy Big Jean, machine gunner in the 4th Company, who would jump into the fire for me. I gathered my strength, a bit reassured. "Captain," I said, "who are the witnesses who dare to bring such an accusation against me? I have the right to know their names. Present them to me, and you'll see how I'll prove them wrong." "Fine," said the drunkard. "I'll see what I can do." I went to work in search of the one survivor of the squad, Big Jean, whom I found at a crossroads of communication trenches where his machine gun was emplaced. Of course, he had never spoken a word to anyone about the outpost affair. He got really worked up at the baseless rumours which had reached the ear of the captain. "You know," said Big Jean to me, "if anyone causes something bad to happen to you, I'll kill him." Deeply moved, we embraced each other before we parted company. Nothing further ever came of this business, and Captain Cheffaut never said anything about it to me again. On March 23rd, under cover of a very dark night, a German patrol got into our lines and captured 3 sentries who weren't expecting this kind of nocturnal visit. The Germans were going to haul away a 4th and had tied a rope around his neck, but he head-butted a Boche right in the belly and got away, sounding the alarm. When our side showed up in force, the patrol had disappeared, along with the 3 prisoners. This nighttime kidnapping caused a lot of ruckus in our sector. The general and the colonel were furious. For several days at roll call, there were lamentations, blames, threats, clear instructions about prisoners, friendly sentries, outposts, etc. The colonel ordered that we, in turn, go and grab up a few Boches from their trenches to avenge this affront which they had inflicted upon us. An elite patrol was put together for this purpose, but it failed miserably and came back empty-handed, missing 1 man who never returned. All the colonel had to do was to go out and cross through the impenetrable tangle of barbed wire in the darkness. He'd see how easy it was. You had to be as tenacious as a Boche to crawl your way through, carving out a path with a pair of shears. All this accursed month of March, the weather was terrible, bitterly cold, with fog, rain and snow squalls. But that didn't stop the firefights or the violent bombardments which rained down upon Maison Champagne to take and retake a few stretches of broken-down trench line. It wasn't that the possession of these trenches had any capital importance for one adversary or the other. It came from a sense of prestige, of conceit, of glory for the generals responsible, both French and German. The sufferings and deaths of hundreds and thousands of soldiers counted for little in relation to all that. Due to more and more frequent bombardments on Dommartin, the supply column had pulled back to Valmy. One by one, the 3 corporals took turns going to the supply column to report to our liaison. On March 26th, it was my turn. I left Ville-sur-Tourbe at 2 in the afternoon, taking the road to Saint-Ménehould. At 3 kilometres, I passed through the village of Berzieux, completely destroyed and deserted. All by itself, in an underground shelter, an ambulance Americaine, American Volunteer Field Hospital, was installed. Leaving this village, there were several forks in the road. I asked a territorial which one I should take to get to Courtemont, the next village which I was supposed to reach. But he gave me the wrong directions, and the road I took was soon nothing more than a vague, muddy footpath which petered out in unfarmable fields. I kept on walking, hoping to see the bell tower of Courtemont at any moment. All of a sudden, the snow started coming down heavily, wiping out any trace of a road. Soon I was walking any which way, and I began to get really worried, especially since daylight was already fading, when I happened upon the rails of a narrow-gauge railway. I followed it, thinking that it would surely take me to some inhabited place. Indeed, I soon came upon a wooden structure and a storage dump next to it. On a sign I read, Point K Station. A couple of territorials were inside the station. They told me that I had gone the opposite way from Valmy, and that the station was 15 kilometers away. I had to be in Valmy before 6 o'clock to get instructions from the corporal whom I was relieving. A nice bit of bad luck for me. Meanwhile, these good territorials invited me to approach their roaring fire, obliged me to share their dinner, and gave me a swig of hooch. Finally, an unhoped-for lucky break. A taco train came down from the trenches at about 5 o'clock, heading for Valmy. I hoisted myself onto the running board, because on these trains there weren't any first or second-class cars. The empty train moved rapidly downhill, and I was thoroughly frozen upon arrival at the Valmy station. In ordinary times, I wouldn't have gotten out of this without some inflammation in the chest, some congestion, or at least a bad cold. But we had grown insensitive, toughened against hardships like savage, primitive men, and the next day I was fresh and healthy as usual. I profited from my stay in Valmy by climbing the hillock which dominates the village, and where the monument to Kellerman stands. On its base I read, "From this place, from this date, a new era begins. Goethe." There is also a chapel and a funeral mound upon which is inscribed the last wish of the victor of Valmy, that his heart be buried among the soldiers who died on the field of battle. That should give pleasure to those who left their bones on this battlefield. Finally, on a post I read, "Here stood the mill of Valmy," which appears in paintings and prints depicting the battle. One morning the Germans send our way some inoffensive little balloons from which were suspended packets of newspapers. A slow-burning match was attached to the string holding the packet, which allowed it to fall when the match burned through the string. 2 of these fell on the village. It did no good to order us not to open these packets, to hand them over to the military authorities immediately, that anyone found carrying one of these newspapers would be punished. It was no use. There was a rush to snatch up the newspapers. I was lucky enough to put my hands on 2 or 3 of these famous Gazettes des Ardennes. There you could read lists of names of French soldiers buried in occupied territory, clippings from French newspapers reprinted without comment, and some anti-English articles. On the illustrated pages were engravings taken from French newspapers, and a photograph of a long column of French prisoners taken last February 15th at Maison Champagne, which took up a whole page. Nothing sensational about that. But the Germans sent over other things besides children's balloons. From time to time, big projectiles whistled over Valmy, brushing past the hilltop where Kellerman seemed to be trying to catch them with the big hat in his hand, and continued on until they landed 2 or 3 kilometers farther. I don't know where. Nevertheless, none of them ever fell on the village. The Germans seemed to want to respect this historic place where their great-grandfathers had fought. But on March 31st, a devil of a Boche gunner, doubtless without meaning to, aimed a bit short, and a nice little 350mm shell, if you please, plummeted down like a race car, barely 2 meters from the makeshift barn where the company's mules and horses were stabled. By a stroke of bad luck, I was going to visit our mules, along with my friend Castet, the driver of our gun. The shell struck the ground a few steps away from us. By all logic, we should have been pulverized, vaporized into thin air, with no trace of what happened to us. By great luck, landing on damp earth which had been soaked by the daily rains, the shell didn't explode and instead ploughed deeply into the ground, digging a hole that a 12-year-old kid could have easily climbed into. But the violent shock was such that we were thrown brutally to the ground and terrified by the frightful shriek of the projectile. Covered with mud, we stayed motionless for a moment without realizing what had happened. Castet, who had a black terror of shellfire, almost fainted dead away when he saw the terrible danger which we had just escaped, not by a miracle, but by flawed manufacture of the shell or other natural cause. The horses and mules, war-hardened as they were, had been badly shaken up by the monstrous shriek of the shell and the shower of stones and mud which rained down when it fell. At the same time, the barn was 3/4 demolished, and several of the beasts broke loose and fled in distress, to the great despair of their handlers. In the churchyard were several hundred graves of military men who had died in the Valmy field hospital. Since the Chalons-Sainte-Menehould rail line passed close by, they had camouflaged the cemetery with tarpaulins and branches to mask the view from impressionable travellers. That's true. Rows, ranks and squares of crosses. How sad, how monotonous. Let's hide them from the happy, satisfied citizens. That's the opposite of glory. In the church, tourists admire the magnificent stained-glass windows presented by dukes, counts, generals, princesses of the Kellerman family, each one containing a portrait of the donor. Meanwhile, on April 1st, we learned that our division was to be relieved, and at nightfall I went up with the drivers to retrieve our pieces from the front line. One more night of fatigue and danger, of being bombarded, and of treacherous roads, rain and snow. To get some rest the next day, we were going to rejoin the regiment at Bro-Sainte-Cohière, on the road to Sainte-Menehould.